Planet America's fake news.
What the hell is going on here?
Hello, welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chaz Ciadello.
This week, Democratic presidential frontrunner Joe Biden faces a Me Too moment.
I hear what they're saying. I understand it.
Also this week, a deep dive into the battle for free speech on college campuses.
The power balance between the kind of student that wants to shut down offensive speech and everyone else has it's tilted a little bit more in their favor.
Concerns over the future of NATO in the Trump era. Our guest, former US NATO Ambassador Nick Burns.
We're much stronger together than we would be on our own.
But first, let's hit that campaign trail.
This incredibly long and expensive election campaign leading to the statistically likely re-election of President Trump 2020.
At least 7 women have now accused former Vice President Joe Biden of touching them inappropriately. Biden's nascent White House campaign went into damage control this week after Lucy Flores, a former Nevada Assemblywoman, was the first to say that she was made to feel, quote, uneasy, gross and confused when Biden kissed her at a 2014 campaign event.
He leans down, smells my hair, and then plants this big, long kiss on the top of my head. In my brain, I just kept thinking, the Vice President of the United States is smelling me. The Vice President of the United States is touching me. He's kissing me. And I just don't know what to do.
Flores says that Biden's contact was inappropriate but not sexual. A second woman, Amy Lapos, then alleged that Biden rubbed noses with her at a 2009 fundraiser in Connecticut. Lapos telling the local Hartford Courant newspaper it wasn't sexual, but he did grab her by the head, put his hand around her neck, pulled her in to rub noses, and that she thought he was going to kiss her on the mouth. Another 5 women have since come forward to make similar claims. Biden's defenders have suggested there may be more to this than meets the eye, pointing out that Lucy Flores, who you may recall was on this program in 2017, is a prominent backer of Senator Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, she also became a board member for the Bernie spin-off group Our Revolution and only resigned from that position last year.
Among the Biden supporters is Stephanie Carter, wife of former US Defense Secretary Ash Carter, who has rejected suggestions that this shoulder rub was another example of inappropriate touching. She says it was a welcome show of support from a close friend. Democrat House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, meanwhile, says that while the claims don't disqualify Biden from running for president, she thinks he needs to change.
He's an affectionate person to children, to senior citizens, to everyone. That's just the way he is. People's space is important to them, and what's important is how they receive it, not necessarily how you intended it.
President Trump, who has himself, of course, been accused of inappropriate behaviour by multiple women, has alleged a conspiracy by socialists to bring Biden down.
He's being taken care of pretty well by the socialists. They got to. Our former vice president, I was going to call him, I don't know him well, I was going to say, welcome to the world, Joe. You having a good time, Joe?
And for his part, Chaz, Joe Biden has denied doing anything inappropriate, but he says it is up to him to move with the times.
Social norms have begun to change, they've shifted, and the boundaries of protecting personal space have been reset. And I get it. I get it. I hear what they're saying. I understand it. And I'll be much more mindful. That's my responsibility.
He's not getting away with it that easy, John. The internet is filled with pics of creepy Uncle Joe grabbing reporters, standing kinda close to world leaders, giving friendly pats to unimpressed troopers, and having a big sniff of Eva Longoria's hair at the very same event he upset Lucy Flores at. And then there is this clip. Super awkward. Yep, no one wants to be that girl. Except that girl is Senator Chris Coons' daughter. And Coons insists that she did not think of that incident as anything and that she had known Biden all her life. Maybe. And the fact that Biden has so much support from women probably helps him. But that doesn't change the fact that nowhere in his statement did Joe Biden actually apologise. And in the excerpt that John played, Biden seems to imply that the standards of how you treat women now are different, even though one of those women was creeped out by Biden way back in 2008. I'm not sure that respecting women's space has changed that much in the last few decades, but what definitely has changed is what an authority figure can't get away with, as Joe is now learning. Although luckily for Biden, some Liberals are still pretty forgiving to their mates.
I don't know that we will see any more smelling of hair and kisses on the forehead.
That pisses me off. Yeah. I'm telling you, because, well, I don't want Joe to stop doing that.
No, don't stop smelling hair, Joe. Anyway, it hasn't killed Biden's campaign yet, John, but I would suggest if my weakness was that I was super old, I probably wouldn't want it reinforced that my personal stands are incompatible with modern society. I suspect that is where it's going to hurt Biden the most.
Well, we'll see. Meanwhile, President Trump, who reportedly sees Biden as his toughest potential challenger for re-election next year, was very happy to ding the former Veep again, tweeting out this clip today.
Welcome back, Joe.
And Joe Biden hit back also on Twitter saying, I see that you're on the job and presidential as always. Can't wait for 2020, Chaz.
Big, beautiful world.
You'd have to be living under a rock to not know that America's been producing a heap of
jobs, MAGA.
Trump really has delivered in a huge way. What?
Yes, we can.
Fine. If we look at total number of jobs, you added a few jobs as well, Obama.
That's true. True story.
Yes, okay, you added jobs at the same rate as Trump, but it's harder to add jobs at the top of the business cycle. Anyway, 19 states have now registered record low unemployment rates under Trump. In fact, the number of unemployed people has dropped so far that there are now over 1 million less people looking for jobs than jobs looking for people. Job openings. And what happens when workers are in demand? Employers are forced to pay more for them and real wages go up. Finally, this year, America is seeing some genuine wage growth. And it's not just any wage growth. You see, over the last 10 years, a whole bunch of senior citizens with high school education or less have retired. There are now 4.5 million less people without college degrees in the workforce. And they have been replaced by a whole bunch of millennials with college degrees. There are 13 million more of them. So since there are less blue-collar workers, blue-collar jobs like construction, production and transportation have seen much larger drops in unemployment since 2009 than white-collar jobs like office workers and professionals and business people. So the blue-collar workers are actually more in demand, and therefore median weekly earnings since 2009 have increased more for the uneducated people than for the educated people. Note, by the way, this is the percentage change in earnings, okay? These guys here obviously earn a lot more money than those guys. But this leaves us with a wonderful graph showing just for once the first quintile, which is the blue line here, it's the bottom 20% of income earners has enjoyed a bigger percentage increase in their pay packet than anyone else in the last 12 months. But before you market enthusiasts get too excited, I said don't get excited. You're too excited, Steve. It's just a graph. Bear in mind that this increase in poor people's wages might have something to do with the minimum wage being increased in 19 states at the beginning of this year. Either way, it looks like the working poor are finally catching a break and they can rest easy as long as there isn't a recession. Oh, bugger.
Big, beautiful world.
After announcing last week that
the Republican Party will become the party of great health care
and that he was
moving forward in the courts and legislatively.
This week, President Trump slammed on the brakes.
The Republicans are developing a really great health care plan. A vote will be taken right after the election when Republicans hold the Senate and win back the House. It will be truly great health care that will work for America.
And here's why. After restarting the battle over healthcare last week when the Justice Department decided not to defend Obamacare in court, he's now kicked the can past the next election. Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell made it very clear he wanted nothing to do with another losing fight over healthcare in this Congress.
So I made it clear to him we were not going to be doing that in the Senate.
Meanwhile, President Trump has backed away from a threat to shut down the US border with Mexico after stiff opposition from congressional Republicans and business. Instead, President Trump says that Mexico has 12 months to stop the flow of illegal immigrants and drugs or face tariffs.
We're going to give them a 1-year warning, and if the drugs don't stop or largely stop, we're going to put tariffs on Mexico and products, in particular cars. The whole ball game is cars. It's the big ball game.
Not about ball games, but it was American car makers who warned that a border shutdown would halt local production within days because they rely on prompt delivery of components made in Mexico. And they said that would threaten 2.4 million jobs. At the same time, President Trump has moved to cut off around $700 million in aid that has already been allocated to 3 Central American nations, Guatemala, Honduras and El Salvador. There is some confusion over whether the money will come from funds that have not yet been designated for specific programs or whether the administration will actually be seeking to break existing contracts with NGOs, Chaz.
Yeah, there's a lot of confusion, all right, John, and that's just from the Fox News bar guy. 3 Mexicos. Imagine how much wall that would require. Also, if you're worried about drugs coming from Mexico, why would you take $2.5 billion out of the Defense Department drug interdiction program like Trump has and spend it on a few extra miles of wall? Having said that, I do totally understand why Trump is so frustrated by the border. It is a mess. People smugglers are now even offering an express bus service from Guatemala so more families can get to the border in a matter of days. The border apprehensions are going through the roof. Look at that blue line at the top there. These are the highest monthly numbers since 2006, and they are only going up. But unlike in 2006, these aren't single men, they're unaccompanied kids and a whole lot of families. And they all require special facilities which Customs do not have. So they end up crammed in a car park for a few hours and then released. That's right, not detained, not even given ankle bracelets, they're just allowed to leave with a notice to appear in court sometime. That is what Trump calls catch and release. So, what can you do? Building a wall or shutting down the border isn't going to help much. These people are asylum seekers. They're happy to be caught. They don't even need to get past the wall. Have a look. The Rio Grande is the border, and you can't build a wall in that highlighted area because it's too close to the river. But it is still American territory. So asylum seekers just need to get there and line up politely at the gate where those dots are. There's the photo of it, and America is legally obliged to process every single one of them. The wall did not stop them. What might is working with Central America to reduce the gang-related activity that's pushing people to flee. A study found if you reduce the murder rate in Central America and make people feel safer, it directly reduces the number of children showing up at the American border. This is also something, by the way, that Democrats agree with, so you could get bipartisan support. Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen made one such agreement just last week, expressing her profound gratitude to our Central American allies for their commitment to our common cause of secure borders and more orderly migration flows. But then the next day, the president took away their foreign aid.
We were paying them tremendous amounts of money, and we're not paying them anymore because they haven't done a thing for us.
Oh well. You could strengthen the Remain in Mexico program maybe, where asylum seekers are processed and then sent to Mexico where they're given a work permit. They're kept track of and they stay there until their American court date. So no more catch and release. Kirstjen Nielsen struck a deal this week for that as well, for hundreds of additional migrants a day to remain in Mexico. While at the same time, the president was tweeting that he was going to punish Mexico by shutting down the border because Mexico is doing nothing to help stop the flow of illegal immigrants to our country. There are no easy answers for the situation on America's border, but it doesn't have to be this hard.
This week marks 70 years since the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty and the establishment of NATO to defend against Soviet expansion in Europe. Now, more than a quarter of a century after the collapse of the old Soviet Union, debate rages about whether NATO is perpetuating the Cold War or preventing another world war. The Second World War alliance between the United States and Soviet Russia was always more of a marriage of convenience based on mutual self-interest in defeating Nazi Germany. A classic case of the old proverb, the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin have set the ball rolling for the grand finale, that Britain, America and Russia are bound together in invincible unity.
In Adolf Hitler's final deranged hours as he pinned tin medals on the chests of boy soldiers, he was convinced that as soon as the invading American and Russian armies met, they would turn their guns on each other. Hitler was wrong. The Allies had hammered out a plan for post-war Europe.
First to arrive is the warrior statesman Joseph Stalin. Mr. Churchill, wearing a shapka, seems to have picked up a bit of local colour.
Despite the smiles and hats, the potential for future conflict between the capitalist democracies and communist Russia was very real, especially in Germany.
Victorious Russian troops walked through the rubble where the Nazis made their last stand.
After the German surrender in May 1945, the old Reich was divided up into 4 occupation zones: the French, British, American and Soviet. The capital, Berlin, was deep in the Eastern Soviet zone, so it too was carved up between the 4. But it soon became very clear the Soviet Union was determined to consolidate its sphere of influence through local communist proxies. Within a year, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill sounded this ominous warning.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
Churchill's Iron Curtain speech helped to define the new Cold War.
Soviet Russia was expansively stabbing westward, knifing into nations left empty by war. On orders from the Kremlin, Russia had launched one of history's most drastic political, moral, and economic wars, a Cold War. The United States was obliged to help Europe safeguard its traditional freedoms and the independence of its nations.
Then in 1948, as Britain, France and the United States pushed ahead with plans to create a democratic West Germany, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin imposed a blockade on Berlin, cutting access through East Germany.
As the red noose is drawn closer about the western sector of the capital, switches are pulled on generators, and the fuel famine forces drastic power cuts.
The Berlin blockade continued for almost a year. The Western Allies launched a massive airlift to deliver thousands of tons of food and supplies every day to West Berlin.
These are the men whose nerve-wracking job it may be to fight their way through weather and red obstruction.
More than 250,000 flights. If just one had been shot down by the Russians, it could have triggered a Third World War. On April the 4th, 1949, the leaders of the United States, Britain, France, Canada, Belgium, Denmark, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway and Portugal signed the Washington Treaty, also known as the North Atlantic Treaty.
We will now proceed to the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty.
At the treaty's heart, Article 5, which outlined the principle of collective defence.
They were sworn to stand together against aggression. An attack against one would be an attack against all.
In effect, it placed all members under the American nuclear umbrella.
If there is anything certain today, if there is anything inevitable in the future, it is the will of the people of the world for freedom and for peace.
President Harry Truman talked about peace, but the message NATO sent to Moscow was very clear. Send tanks into Norway and you'll be met with massive force, including atomic weapons.
Peace today can be chiefly assured through strength.
And so the cornerstone of the Western alliance in the Cold War was set. And under the Marshall Plan, the United States provided massive economic and military aid to its partners, and membership expanded in NATO in 1952 to include Greece and Turkey.
The subs will strengthen the Turkish fleet uneasily eyeing Russia.
The entry of West Germany into NATO in 1955 saw the Soviets establish a rival Warsaw Pact. Spain joined NATO in 1980, 8 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Former Warsaw Pact members Poland, the Czech Republic and Hungary joined NATO, taking the alliance's borders 650 kilometres closer towards Russia. In 2004, Bulgaria, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Romania, Slovakia and Slovenia joined NATO, followed in 2009 by Albania and Croatia, and in 2017 by Montenegro. That eastward expansion is a part of Russia's justification for its annexation of Crimea in 2014 and its low-level conflict in eastern Ukraine, which has set the goal of joining NATO. And that's a key grievance in their efforts to destabilise their rivals, including the United States. For his part, President Trump has increased pressure on NATO allies to increase their defence spending to lighten the load on the United States. As a candidate, he'd called NATO obsolete.
Obsolete.
But as president, he says that's changed.
I said it was obsolete. It's no longer obsolete.
And after earlier refusals, President Trump has also moved to reassure NATO allies he would honour the defence guarantee under Article 5.
I'm committing the United States, and have committed, but I'm committing the United States to Article 5.
Well, for more, we're joined by Nicholas Burns. He was the Director of Soviet and Russian Affairs under the first President Bush. He served on Bill Clinton's National Security Council and was appointed ambassador to NATO by President George W. Bush. These days, he's based at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Ambassador Burns, welcome back to Planet America.
Thanks so much.
President Trump says that NATO is no longer obsolete and he has reaffirmed Article 5. Has that allayed the concerns of members about his commitment to NATO?
I don't think it has. This is a celebratory week in many ways. We're celebrating Thursday, April 4th, the 70th anniversary of this great alliance of ours, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. President Trump, however, has been highly ambivalent about Article 5, whether he would protect our allies should they be threatened or attacked by an adversary like Russia. He has not been stalwart, to say the least, in standing up to President Putin. He's become a leading critic of the small d democratic members of the alliance like Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany. He's become a proponent of the anti-democratic populists like Viktor Orban in Hungary. A lot of problems here with the president's leadership, in my judgment, and he's been widely criticized here in the United States for having been a weak and reactive leader of NATO. I don't think words are going to help. I think we need to see consistent performance and consistent devotion to NATO. I hope that will happen because the United States president ought to support NATO.
Does every president really need to go around reaffirming the NATO treaty and Article 5 in particular? Isn't it kind of set in stone at this point?
I wish there wasn't the need for a reaffirmation of Article 5, but if the president campaigned by saying NATO was obsolete, and as president, he has never consistently upheld the Article 5 commitment. And as you know, deterrence against an adversary, a potential adversary like Vladimir Putin, only works if Putin believes that we are serious, that the most powerful leader of the alliance, the President of the United States, will be serious in protecting Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania. And if we're ambiguous about that or unclear about it, then that might mean that we don't succeed in deterring that adversary. So it's critically important that we say what we believe, and the President's failed to do that, which is a great concern to our Congress. Our Republicans and Democrats in the United States don't agree on much in our Congress, but they've rallied behind NATO this week in Washington, D.C.
How much credit does President Trump deserve, though, for putting pressure on NATO members to increase their own defence spending?
President Trump does deserve credit. He was right to raise this issue from the beginning of his time in office. Actually, we've seen 4 consecutive years of real increases in the defense budgets of our NATO allies. It dates back to Putin's annexation of Crimea illegally in 2014. So if we're going to give credit, It should be to both President Trump and President Obama and the other allied leaders, Prime Minister Cameron, for instance, President Macron, Chancellor Merkel. It shouldn't just be credit to one person in the alliance. The trend lines are positive, but I think he's been right to say that particularly Germany, as the most powerful and wealthiest of the European allies, it ought to spend more. At NATO, we say we should spend at least, as a minimum, 2% of our gross domestic product on national defense. Germany spends 1.24%. The U.S. spends 3.5%. So you can see the vast differential between those two efforts.
To what extent are Russian concerns about the spread of NATO membership into the old Soviet sphere of influence justified?
You know, I don't think they're justified at all. We don't live in the world of Stalin and Yalta, the end of World War II, when the Red Army controlled Eastern Europe. We should want to live in a world, and we've created a Europe, the Europe and North America together, where these countries can decide their own fates. And all those countries that were in the Warsaw Pact and the 3 Baltic countries that were imprisoned in the Soviet Union, they've elected to join the European Union and to join NATO. They don't want to be part of a Russian empire led by Vladimir Putin, and they shouldn't. So frankly, I think one of the great things that we've done, and in our case here in the U.S., it's been President Clinton, President George W. Bush, President Obama, and now President Trump, who've all supported this effort to expand NATO and the EU. I think it's one of the most positive things we've done to ensure freedom and the security of these countries.
What do you say to criticisms that after 70 years, NATO is actually helping to perpetuate a Cold War mentality and making Europe less safe as a result?
I don't agree with that criticism. Very few people, I think, would in Europe or North America. The facts are, and I'm sure Australians, you understand this, you're an allied country as well, we're much stronger together than we would be on our own. The physics of that works, number one. Number two, Putin is trying through hybrid warfare, through cyber attacks, through social media, through intelligence operations, to destabilize countries like the Netherlands, Germany, and France in their 2017 elections. We know he attacked our election, and so we need an organization where we pool our resources, we confront that problem together, we mount our defenses together. It stands to reason that that kind of organization is modern. We need it in the 21st century as we needed it in the 20th century.
So we've now seen the Barr letter explaining the findings of Special Counsel Mueller on Russian election interference. How do you now feel about all of that?
You know, that was a very consequential report by Director Robert Mueller. He's a man of enormous integrity, and when he concluded that there was no collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russian government, I believed him. I think he's an honorable person who made an objective judgment. But he did something else in the report, Robert Mueller. He said, beyond a shadow of a doubt, the Russians did interfere in our 2016 election. And there's no question about it. Our intelligence agencies who have spoken publicly about this have concurred. And I think our job here in the United States is to make sure that we're protecting the integrity of how we count votes, how elections are organized. In our country, the federal government does not organize our elections. That's done by state and local authorities. They need help to defend against potential Russian cyber attacks in the future. In that respect, the Mueller report is a warning that we have to protect our democracies. That's true of Australia, and it's true of the United States as well.
Ambassador Nick Burns, thanks once again for your time.
Thanks, John. Thanks so much for having me on the show today.
America is home to 14 of the top 16 ranked universities in the world. And yet 61% of people say that higher education is heading in the wrong direction, including 73% of Republicans. So why is that? Well, most people seem to agree that colleges cost too much. We'll talk more about that in another segment. But only Republicans worry that students are protected too much from views that they might find offensive, and that too many professors are bringing their political and social views into the classroom. Now, that might explain a fairly worrying set of statistics. Only 36% of Republicans said that colleges are having a positive effect on the country. Half that of Democrats. And if we break those numbers down further, only 31% of wealthy Republicans said college had a positive effect on the country, and that's when 46% of poor Republicans thought college had a positive effect. And wait for it, 32% of Republican college graduates said that colleges are having a positive effect on the country, which is a worse result than from Republicans who hadn't been to college. Now, that is not a good result for the country. But is it true? Have colleges become left-wing havens? Well, let's start with the students. And the Conservatives have been pretty consistently about 22% of first-year students for decades. Lefties have risen about 15% over the last 40 years, but there are still more moderates or non-political types there. Although it does seem like recently lefties have gained about 8% at the expense of the moderates. Well, what about professors? In a 2014 survey, 60% of faculty members self-identified as liberal or far left, compared to 13% who were conservatives, for a ratio of 5-to-1. Last year, there was another study of 51 of the top liberal arts colleges with nearly 9,000 professors, and the ratio of Democrats to Republicans was 10.4-to-1. Take away military colleges and the ratio was 12.7-to-1. And almost 80% of departments had 0 Republicans. This even makes Mike Bloomberg furious.
In the 2012 presidential race, according to Federal Election Commission data, 96% of all campaign contributions from Ivy League faculty and employees went to Barack Obama.
96% of political donations went to Obama. Well, as an ABC host, I have to say that anything more than 90% is downright biased. So colleges are very left. But are they cracking down on free speech? Well, according to Dartmouth students, they are. A recent survey of students there found 69% of Republicans thought free speech was threatened, compared to 21% of Democrats. And in the 2017 national poll, 54% of students reported self-censoring in the classroom at some point, with 14% more very liberal students feeling comfortable expressing their opinions in the classroom than very conservative students did. And 21% more very liberal students felt comfortable expressing themselves outside the classroom. Now, admittedly, Republican students have their own free speech issues. In that same national survey, 60% of Republican students thought they shouldn't even have to walk past a protest on campus, while only 28% of Democratic students thought the same thing. Snowflakes! But anyone who has watched Tucker Carlson's semi-regular college segment knows the right have plenty of material to point to.
Time now for Campus Craziness. There's an inexhaustible supply of that.
At this point in time, I should probably point out that we're talking about very small numbers of people here. In that poll from before, 2% of students said that they would be willing to participate in actions to prevent a guest speaker event, and only 1% said they'd be prepared to use violence. So why don't we speak to someone who actually writes about this stuff for a living, Robbie Suave, and find out what's going on in the real world.
I think it's about a chilling climate. You know, when a provocative, usually a conservative speaker tries to come to campus, like Charles Murray, or I just saw, for instance, Matt Walsh, who's a Christian conservative blogger for the website The Daily Wire, was invited to speak at Baylor University in a few days, and there are students there who are trying to get that event shut down. So those kinds of things happen, but I'm almost more concerned about the professors, many of them, you know, quite left-wing, but are somehow out of step with what their kind of woke, intersectional, progressive students think and want, and they're kind of afraid to have nuanced or difficult conversations with these students in the classroom. I mean, I saw, for instance, at Sarah Lawrence College, a conservative professor there, Sam Abrams, the students want him investigated for writing an op-ed for the New York Times that they disagreed with. I mean, that's a kind of thing that I think is really alarming on a university campus.
That's why the president has now issued this executive order.
Every year, the federal government provides educational institutions with more than $35 billion in research funding. If a college or university doesn't allow you to speak, we will not give them money. It's very simple.
And it was so simple, he had a bit of time to talk about Married at First Sight.
I've been watching this for too long. I've been watching things that are unwatchable, and I don't like it.
No arguments here. But will the executive order solve the problem? Robbie?
A, I'm just skeptical of executive orders in general. B, I'm skeptical that, Trump would, rather than Congress, is the right entity, constitutionally speaking, to decide how research funding is allocated. And 3, I'm not even sure I would want to necessarily take research funding away from institutions. How would you handle this? What if the students, it's not always the university's fault if the students are illiberal, if the students are the problem. What should the university do about it? It's not always clear. So I think it's very wrong-headed for many reasons. However, the executive order doesn't really explain or detail how a decision would be made or what criteria the agencies of the federal government will be using to kind of determine this. It's very vague. So I just kind of my guess is that nothing really comes of it despite the executive order, which I think would be the best outcome.
But on the other hand, maybe the problem is solving itself. According to the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, or FIRE, attempted rejections of guest speakers, or disinvitations as they're called, have gone way down in the last year. Also, fewer teachers have been sacked for controversial speech, both liberal speech and conservative speech. So are we just fighting the previous war?
I still don't think that database tells the whole story because, as I said, there are a lot of people who won't even dare to invite a controversial speaker because they know what happens if you do. There are people self-censoring because of the climate of censorship, because of what has happened over the last couple of years. Young people or students of today are actually more inclined than the public at large to say that people with offensive opinions can and should be stripped of their rights on a college campus. It's an issue to be somewhat concerned about.
Well, at least there's one place where everyone can be heard.
Send it to campuscraziness@foxnews.com. We'd appreciate hearing from you as always. There's a lot to choose from.
So when will this interview actually be on? I have friends in Australia who'd like to watch it.
9 o'clock, Friday night.
Oh, well, they'll be watching football. So
Cut him off! What? We're not at college.
Congressional Democrats stepped up their pressure on Attorney General Bill Barr to release as much of the Mueller report into 2016 election interference as possible this week. The House Judiciary Committee has cleared the way to use a subpoena to force the release of the full report and any evidence gathered throughout the investigation. The committee chair, Jerry Nadler, has also requested all communications between the Department of Justice and the special counsel, including summaries of the report. President Trump, though, says he's happy for Mueller's report to be released in full.
If that's what he'd like to do, I have nothing to hide. This was a hoax. This was a witch hunt. I have absolutely nothing to hide.
The New York Times reported this week that some of Mueller's investigators believe that Bill Barr's memo to Congress last week failed to adequately portray the findings of their inquiry and that they were more troubling for President Trump than Mr. Barr indicated. Investigators expected more of their summaries to appear in Barr's memo. The Times also says that Barr and other Justice Department officials have a gripe of their own, believing the special counsel's investigators fell short of their task by declining to decide whether Mr. Trump illegally obstructed the inquiry. That left it up to Barr and his deputy, Rod Rosenstein, to decide not to pursue an obstruction case against the president.
John, you say Trump's happy for the report to come out.
That's what he said.
But he didn't seem too happy to me when he was talking about Nadler's request this week.
It's hypocrisy and it's a disgrace.
Now, the reason Trump's calling Nadler a hypocrite is because back in 1998, when the Ken Starr report was coming out against Bill Clinton, Nadler said this about censoring the Starr report under Rule 6E.
Much of this material is Federal Rule 6E material, that is material that by law, unless contravened by a vote of the House, must be kept secret. It's grand jury material.
So that does seem hypocritical. Secrecy then about grand jury material, but not so much now. To be fair though, in 1998, Nadler was saying this grand jury material shouldn't be revealed to the public, whereas now he's asking for the full report to be revealed to Congress, and then Congress can ensure that what is released to the public isn't over-censored. Because let's be clear, the law does dictate there needs to be some censoring. The question is, how much people trust Bill Barr to make that call. The fact that Mueller's investigators seem to be leaking for the first time against Barr probably isn't a great sign. Although we should remember that Mueller is helping Bill Barr do the redacting. Now, Rachel Maddow forgot that this week and she was accidentally fact-checked live.
It is hard to believe that they'd leave the newly appointed 68-year-old Attorney General William Barr to himself personally pick through the report to try to figure out what mentions in this 400-page report might pertain to open cases.
Oops. I just happened to see that clip when I was watching her show. How would you be? I can't even imagine it.
Before we go, President Trump had both doctors and genealogists scratching their heads this week. First came this claim about windmills, although it was in the context of talking about power-generating wind turbines.
If you have a windmill anywhere near your house, congratulations. Your house just went down 75% in value. And they say the noise causes cancer. You tell me that one, okay?
But you'll be pleased to learn none of that is actually correct. The American Cancer Society says they're unaware of any credible evidence linking windmill noise to cancer. Experts say the same applies to turbines. Iowa Republican Senator Chuck Grassley, usually a bit of a Trump supporter, has described that windmill statement as, quote, idiotic. And then, even more strangely,
my father is German, right? Was German, and born in a very wonderful place in Germany.
And that wonderful place in Germany where President Trump's father Fred was born, it's called the Bronx, and it's actually in New York, although his grandfather was born in Karlstadt in Bavaria. That's what he must have been thinking about.
Yeah, you know that wind thing before, though? He didn't actually make that up.
Really?
Yeah, no, it's all in the Irish Daily Mail from 4 years ago. The theory is that any kind of late-night noise deprives you of sleep, and sleep deprivation makes you overweight, which makes you more susceptible to all kinds of diseases, including, finally, cancer. So it's kind of like the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon for junk science. By that logic, literally anything that makes a noise gives you cancer. Playing Baby Shark all night gives you cancer. If you don't self-harm first, of course.
Well, just so that we're not accused of causing any unnecessary cancers, we're going to end the show right there. We're out of time anyway.
There is plenty more to talk about on our Planet Extra on iView and Facebook right there. See you there.
Bye-bye.